guys, it's Grace Bryan, and I'm here today to talk to you about sewing your own cloth face masks. So I designed my own pattern for a cloth face mask that I really like. My husband, who's an EMT, helped me out with it. And I really like this pattern because I think that it stays on your head well, which is important. I found it was hard with some of the patterns I'd used before to get the strap to stay high and low. They just all wanted to fall down behind my neck. And then there wasn't a good seal and it was gaping. So this mask is sort of shaped more like an N95. It's rounder, and it's meant to have a strap around your neck and one at the top tied like high above your ears over your head. The other thing I like about this pattern is that it doesn't have anything looping around your ears. I tried a pattern that had that and it was so uncomfortable. It just really, I could barely wear it for like longer than 10 minutes at a time. Let's talk about what materials we're gonna need and tools. I want to make this easy for people that don't have a lot of fabric and elastic. I know it's really hard to find elastic right now. I was lucky to already have some, but it ran out really quickly. So I've had to get creative figuring out what to use instead. So I have some ideas for you guys as far as ties and also fabric, and I'll get more into that in a little bit. I used my sewing machine for this, which I think is definitely the easiest option. If you have one, I would highly recommend using it. You can hand sew, that's fine. So you need a needle and thread for that. It just might take a little longer, but that's okay. You're gonna need scissors. Very non-negotiable. We're gonna need to cut a lot of things. You might want a pencil to mark the pattern on the fabric. And that's all you really need. As far as things that you might want that could make this easier and make your finished product look a little bit better, I would recommend an iron for sure. It's your best friend if you're sewing. Most of you probably already know that. We're gonna also need some pins if you like to sew with pins. Also, I like to use a safety pin to help me thread the tie or elastic through the channel at the end. And I think that's all that you need. I apologize if I think of something else later. So that being said, you can find this pattern on Lady Farmer's website. It's totally free and you can print it off and then cut it out. And that is the first thing that we need to get started. You guys run into any trouble or you need help, you have questions, keep in mind there is the online written instructions that might help to clarify something if it's not clear through the video. I'm also happy to answer any questions that you guys may have if you reach out to me on my personal Instagram account. With all that being said, we're ready to start sewing. So grab your pattern, print it out, and meet me back here. Got our pattern all printed out. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna cut along this bold line here. And we're gonna cut out each one. This is the front pattern and this is the lining pattern. I cut my pattern out and we have both pieces. We've got the lining and the front, and now it's time to choose our fabrics. I wanna use something that's relatively thin so that it's easier to sew. I have some fabric scraps here that I'm gonna use, but if you don't have any fabric scraps, you could always use a cloth napkin or a pillowcase or an old bed sheet or a dish towel or a thin curtain or some old clothing, as long as it's not knit like a t-shirt, because that will stretch. Some things you might not want to use would be like a bath towel or any kind of thick upholstery fabric. And then again, like any kind of sweater material or things, because those are just going to stretch and get bigger and they might not make as good of a seal. Lining, you can really use any fabric. It doesn't matter what it looks like. So I'm going to use this muslin because you won't see it. It'll be on the inside. And then this is an old dress that I had. I just have this little bit left, but I'm going to use this for the front. You want to make sure that you have enough fabric that you can cut out 2 of each pattern piece with that fabric. Next, I'm going to iron these out because these are just really wrinkly. If you don't have an iron, it's fine. Like, you don't need to worry about it. It's just if you do, it makes it a little bit easier to cut and sew, and then the end result looks a lot cleaner. But it's definitely not necessary just to make a functional mask. I've got my iron here and I'm going to iron with the grain. Wow, this is super wrinkly. So I do have some steam in my iron. We'll try to get as much of those wrinkles out as possible. Okay, so that looks a lot better. I did use my other hand to spray some water on it, and it's looking a lot nicer. So I am going to actually fold this so that I can get two pieces without having to cut them twice. So I'm going to have that one there. And then because this is a print and it's a one-sided fabric, we want to make sure that we're cutting one pattern piece this way and one the opposite direction. So an easy way to do that is to just fold your fabric up, and then because they're sandwiched right sides together, you're guaranteed that one will be one direction and one will be the other. The next step was to draw around the pattern piece onto the fabric. So I just used this pen. It's probably not the greatest thing ever, but it's been working for me. I traced this one and then I traced around that one. You can also use Taylor's chalk or like a colored pencil or a normal pencil, but a pen is fine too. I probably wouldn't use a marker because that might bleed. If you sew with patterns, you might notice that I did not put a grain line on here, which is because I anticipate some of you guys needing to get creative with your orientation so that you can fit as many onto your fabric as possible, depending on how many masks you want to make, or you might not have a big piece of fabric you're working with. So I'm just cutting them. I'm not worrying about a grain line. I'm just putting them on to maximize a fabric usage. Now I'm going to go ahead and cut these out. And I'm pretty confident in my ability to cut these without like moving them around so that they're both the same size. So I'm not going to pin them. But if you did want to pin them, you could just put like some sewing pins in like this to keep the layers in place. So I've got these cut out, and there's 2 layers there and 2 layers here. And now we're ready to start sewing. So these are already right sides together, so we don't have to worry about that. Okay, so now we're ready to sew. So I'm going to sew along this curve first, and there's a 1/4 inch seam allowance, which on my machine is just the edge of this clear part. So I'm going to start sewing. I'm going to do a little back stitch, and I'm just going to sew all the way along. Awesome. So now we have both of them sewn. I sewed the other one just the same way. So I'm gonna iron them. Again, if you don't have an iron, you can skip this step. I just wanna set the stitches in. So for the lining, I'm gonna iron it like that and then leave it. Fold this down this way and sort of make sure that it's all popped out in the right direction. Sweet. If you forget which side is the top or the bottom, you can see like which side matches up with the pattern, because we're going to stick them together now, and so we need to make sure that both the tops are together. So oriented correctly, top to top, we're going to take, this is going to go on the inside, and this is going to stay with the seam on the outside, and we're just going to fold it in here like this, and we're going to line up the top edge. And then we're gonna get ready to sew. You can pin it if you want to, but what we're gonna do is we're gonna sew all along this top edge here with a 1/4 inch seam allowance over the top, over this seam. I just pushed both the seam allowances down, and we're gonna keep going all the way, making sure they're lined up to the end. So now that I've sewed along the top, I'm gonna go ahead and make a little snip, being careful not to cut the stitches, just right here, so that when we turn it inside out, it can move a little bit easier. And I'll do the same to the other side. And all right, so now this next step, you can skip if you want to. I think it makes the mask look a little bit cleaner, but it's technically not necessary for the function of the mask. Turn it out right side out, and we're gonna use our iron again. And we're going to press the seam allowance towards the lining fabric from the top. Press the lining away from the front fabric. And it might be hard to do this without ironing down the other spots too, but that's okay. We'll just focus on getting that line nice and crisp. There. And then what we're gonna do next is we're gonna go back to our machine and we're just gonna sew along this line on the lining about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the stitches. Just sew down and sew that seam allowance down. So now I've sewn that down and it just looks nice and clean. So when we turn this inside out, when we're done, you'll have that nice top stitching there. And that'll help keep the layers in place as well. And we did that instead of top stitching all the layers together because that can sometimes tend to make it gape up here. And again, if you wanted to skip that line, you can. The next step for everybody is going to be to turn it back inside out, and then we are going to line up the bottom side. And I like to sew this side with the pattern fabric on top, just so that the seam allowance gets pressed down the same direction. Okay, so now that we've sewed this side, we're gonna do the same thing, just a little snip here, and again on the other side. Excuse my dog. Okay, so now we're gonna turn it inside out through the ends here. You can leave a section of these stitches open right here if you think it might be too difficult to turn it inside out through this. So if you have an iron, we're going to use it again. So I like to sew the side with the top stitching first. So I just like to press it down and make sure that you can see a little bit of the patterned fabric on the outside. And that just helps make it look nice from the outside so you don't see the lining sticking through. That's why the lining pattern was a little smaller than the front fabric pattern. So I press the top and then I like to pull it down. It's easy to tell here to flatten this spot out. You can tell you don't want to iron it so that the lining is bunching. You want to make sure that it's both flat. And if you cut and sewed it correctly, you should have the patterned fabric visible on the back. So we're going to press that down. Then we're going to go to the other side and flatten that out. And again, it's a little wrinkly because we had to squish it all through that opening. Awesome. If you want to, you can top stitch along this bottom right here. I'm going to go ahead and do that, but again, it's not necessary. I'm just going to go on the white part of the lining about 1/8 of an inch, sort of the same distance away on the bottom. I top stitched down this part, so now there's stitching on both sides. Again, the bottom top stitching is just an extra thing that I think makes it look more finished, but it's not necessary. One reason why I like it is because it's helpful. You can always tell which side is the bottom of the mask because you can just find which part has the stitching on the outside. I'm just going to trim some threads here and there. Awesome. Okay, now we're ready to fold the sides down for the elastic. So we're just going to fold one side over, fold it over like that again. I've ironed down the sides to make room for a channel to thread elastic or a ribbon through. If you don't want to have it loop through, you can always sew the ties on also without putting them through the channel. I think this makes for an easier fit because you only have to tie one thing when you're putting it on. For options for what to use, it's pretty hard to find elastic these days. If you have some just already at home, a nice piece of elastic like this that you can loop through and do one loop on the bottom and tie at the top works. You could also do any kind of ribbon. One thing I found that works, although it's a little tight, is a headband. This is just like a normal headband that I got at Walmart. And you could sew this in and then use one strap at the top and one strap at the bottom. It is a little tighter, but it does work. There's also different kinds of hair ties. I found these hair ties and I looped two together. It doesn't allow you to put one at the top and one at the bottom. But you can see there's different ways to get creative with different things. So I think for this one, I'm going to use ribbon to show you guys. It's just like a polyester grosgrain ribbon, but it's thick enough that you could fit like a thicker ribbon through there. I'm going to go ahead and go back to my sewing machine, and I'm just gonna tack these down, and I'm gonna do a back stitch when I start, go all the way across and do another back stitch, and do it on both sides. So I've sewn these down, and I'm just gonna cut all my threads. And then we're ready to thread in our ribbon or elastic. You might be able to get it through on your own, but I like to use a safety pin, and that kind of helps. So the bottom is there because we've got our stitching. So coming from the top, go in, around, and then in through the bottom on the other side. And then get rid of your safety pin, and you've got a bottom loop that can go around your neck, and then a top loop that you can tie on the top of your head. Okay, so here we go. We've got our bottom loop. Gonna put that around my neck. Then we're gonna kind of pull it, get it on our face, tighten it, and then we can tie this up at the top. Didn't really make it even, but with the tails there. But there we go. We've got, it's tight around the bottom of my neck and at the top. And it's pretty comfy, and it doesn't hurt my ears. Yay!